My name is Evelyn Morris. I'm 38, and I live in the heart of Surrey with my husband, Daniel, and our son, Oliver. Daniel and I have been married for 15 years, and Oliver is the center of our world. He's 13 now, but in my mind, he's always been our miracle. You see, for years, we struggled to have a child. Months of doctors, tests, heartbreak, and quiet nights filled with empty hope. Then, one day, after all those years of waiting, Oliver came into our lives like a blessing we never expected. I remember the sound of the creaky stairs in our old house, how the lavender in the garden swayed in the breeze Daniel would sometimes mention as he watered it. Mornings were always chaotic, Oliver running late for school, Daniel making silly jokes to make us laugh. It was in the rhythm of those everyday moments that we found our happiness, our peace. But that peace didn't last forever. And now, I'm left telling you how it all changed. Welcome to this story. Before we start, please hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below to let me know where you're watching from. Your support means the world, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you had asked me a year ago what could possibly tear my family apart, I would have laughed it off and said something light, like burnt toast, or Oliver's habit of forgetting his PE kit. But life has a way of proving you wrong in ways you never imagine. And if someone had told me that everything we treasured would be turned upside down by something as simple as a school phone call, would I have listened? Would you? I suppose that's why I'm telling this now, so that nothing is left to guesswork, so that every moment leading to that day is understood for what it truly was. Because, looking back, there were tiny details I didn't pay attention to. Maybe you'll notice them sooner than I did. Our house in Surrey sits at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the sort of place estate agents describe as family-friendly, and where neighbors wave even if they don't know your name. It has a beige front door that desperately needs a repaint, and a garden that smells of lavender, because Daniel planted far too much of it during a phase he now denies ever having. That morning began like any other. It's always the ordinary days that deceive you the most, isn't it? I was upstairs folding Oliver's school uniform on the bed, smoothing the creases out of his white shirt. I do that every morning, even though I know the moment he sits down on the bus, it'll be rumpled again. But there's something comforting about routines, don't you think? Something safe, something that convinces you that all is right in your world. As I folded his blazer, my fingers slowed. Something about the fabric pulled me back, years back, into a memory so clear it felt like it was happening right in front of me. The cold vinyl chair beneath me, the sharp smell of antiseptic. Daniel's hand gripping mine as if letting go would break us both. That was one of the many clinic visits we endured, back when all we wanted was a family. How many hours did we spend in waiting rooms? How many times did I stare at the posters on the wall, promising hope to couples struggling to conceive? Too many. More than I care to admit out loud. There were nights I cried until my throat was raw. Nights Daniel held me and whispered, "We'll get there, Evie. One day." Nights he didn't know what to say at all. Miscarriages. If you've been through even one, you'll understand. They're not just losses. They're conversations that end too soon. Futures erased in silence. I had 3. Each time, I told myself that perhaps this was the last heartbreak I could bear. And yet, every time we tried again. Why do we do that to ourselves? Is hope really that stubborn? I blinked and forced myself back into the present, placing Oliver's uniform neatly on the chair. I could hear voices drifting up from the kitchen, Daniel's and Oliver's. "Dad, that's not how you say it," Oliver groaned. "It is absolutely how you say it," Daniel insisted. "Your old man is very cultured." "You mispronounced croissant again." "It's the British way," Daniel shot back. I smiled despite myself. Their morning debates were as routine as brushing teeth. I took the steps down the creaking staircase, the one that has made the same complaining sound for the last decade, and stepped into the bright kitchen. Daniel was leaning against the counter, hair sticking up in every direction. Oliver sat at the table, dramatically rolling his eyes at his father, as though enduring the world's greatest suffering. "Morning, Mom," Oliver said, without looking up from his cereal. "Morning. You two at it already?" "He started it," Oliver mumbled. "I most certainly did not," Daniel protested, pointing a spoon at him. I leaned against the doorway, watching them. My boys. My whole life. Sitting there bickering over breakfast pastries. If I'd known what was coming, would I have held that moment closer? Yes. 1,000 times yes. As they bantered, the documentary-style narration in my head clicked on. The one I only ever admit to myself. Because when life feels overwhelming, telling the story as though someone else is watching helps me breathe. We fought for him. We prayed for him. He was our miracle. I remember the day we finally met him. 13 years ago, a cold, gray morning, the delivery room buzzing with urgency, a nurse telling me to push, Daniel whispering, "You're nearly there, Evie." And then, just like that, he arrived. Small, warm, wailing, hours. Or so I believed. That's the part I keep circling back to now. The day he was placed in my arms, I felt something shift inside me. A click, a recognition. Do you know that feeling? When you hold a newborn and you think, yes, this is home. I felt that. I would have sworn my life on it. I still remember Daniel crying. And he doesn't cry. Not even at funerals. He held Oliver so carefully, as though he thought he might break him just by breathing too close. "He's perfect," he whispered. "He's absolutely perfect." And we were, for a long time. At least, we thought we were. But perfection has cracks you don't see until you're looking from the other side, doesn't it? Back in the kitchen, Oliver shoved his chair back and jumped up. "Bus'll be here in 3 minutes," he said. "Where's my blazer?" "On your chair upstairs," I replied. He bolted off, nearly slipping on the rug, and Daniel shook his head. "That boy moves like he's escaping a crime scene," Daniel murmured. I laughed. But a quiet part of me wondered, what were we escaping? What had we overlooked? When Oliver finally thundered down with his bag half-zipped and tie hanging crooked, I straightened it for him like I always do. "Have a good day, love," I said. He nodded, threw a quick "bye" over his shoulder, and ran out the door. Daniel approached me then, wrapping an arm loosely around my waist. "You all right?" he asked. "Of course," I said, but even I could hear the hesitation in my voice. It was nothing dramatic, just a flicker, a whisper of uncertainty I couldn't quite place. Something about Oliver's face when he looked back at us. Was it worry? Was it something else entirely? I brushed it off. You would have too. After all, why question happiness when it's standing right in front of you? If I had known what the next week would bring, I would have paid closer attention to that flicker. But hindsight is cruel like that. And so the chapter of our comfortable life went on. Lavender in the garden, creaking staircase, bickering at breakfast. Beautiful in its simplicity, unaware of the storm creeping toward us. For 13 years, Oliver was my entire world, until the day his blood betrayed us. If I'm being honest, I didn't see it coming. I kept waiting for the calm after the storm, but it never came. The cracks in our little world started small, almost imperceptible. Little things that, on their own, wouldn't have raised alarms. But when you line them up, one after the other, they form a pattern. A pattern I should have noticed sooner. It started with a phone call from school. The head teacher, Mrs. Finch, had a tone in her voice that made my stomach tighten. "Mrs. Morris, I'm afraid Oliver's been caught with some items he didn't pay for. It's just small things, nothing major. But it's the 3rd time this month we've had reports of him taking things that aren't his." I remember holding the receiver, feeling my fingers grow numb. "What sort of things?" I asked, though I already knew. "A pair of headphones, an eraser, and most recently, a classmate's watch. Her voice softened slightly. We've spoken to Oliver, and he insists it's all just mistakes, but I think it's time we had a more serious conversation about his behavior. When I hung up, my mind raced. Oliver? Stealing? It didn't make sense. This wasn't the boy I knew. Sure, he was cheeky, sometimes too cheeky, but a thief? That felt foreign. I walked into the living room, where Daniel was sorting through the mail. I could hear the sound of the clock ticking away, almost mocking me with its regularity, its stability, when nothing else in our lives seemed that steady anymore. Daniel, I said, my voice quieter than I intended. We need to talk. He glanced up from the pile of bills. What's up? Oliver, I began. He's been caught stealing. Small things, headphones, an eraser, a watch. The words sounded surreal as they left my lips. Daniel's face immediately tightened, his jaw setting in a way I knew well. Is he serious? His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. I don't know, I said, walking across the room and sitting down on the arm of the couch. Mrs. Finch thinks it's becoming a pattern. Daniel's face hardened. That's not like him. He knows better than that. I nodded, but I couldn't quite shake the knot in my chest. Maybe he's going through a phase, that teenage rebellion thing. Daniel didn't respond at first, just folded his arms over his chest, his eyes narrowing as though he were measuring the weight of my words. He doesn't behave like either of us, Evie, he said finally, his tone quiet, but cutting. Not a shred of us in him. The words hit me harder than I expected. I stared at him, blinking as if I could will them away. Was he really saying that? Was Daniel starting to doubt our son? Our son, the same boy we had fought for, the boy who had once been our miracle. Daniel, stop it. He's just confused. It's normal. I trailed off, struggling to find the right words. It's just a phase. He'll grow out of it. Daniel's eyes softened for a moment, but he didn't look convinced. You think this is just some phase? Don't you? I replied, my voice rising slightly. I had to believe it. I had to, because otherwise, everything I thought I knew about Oliver, about our family, would crumble. Before Daniel could respond, I heard the heavy thud of footsteps coming from upstairs. Oliver appeared in the doorway, looking like he'd just rolled out of bed, his face clouded with something I couldn't quite place. Why are you two looking at me like that? He muttered, clearly uncomfortable. He pulled at the sleeves of his jumper, avoiding eye contact. Oliver, Daniel said, standing up straight, his tone not quite harsh but firm. We need to talk about your behavior. Oliver rolled his eyes, a move that felt more like a reflex than a conscious choice. Not this again, he muttered, but Daniel didn't let him off the hook. This is important, Daniel insisted. We've had reports from school. I know, okay? Oliver cut in, slamming his bag down on the table. His voice was sharp, his tone defensive. It's just stuff. It's nothing. I could feel my chest tightening as the conversation spiraled out of control. I wanted to say something, anything, to calm the storm brewing in the room, but I wasn't sure what to say anymore. You think stealing is nothing? Daniel's voice rose slightly, the calm facade cracking. Oliver muttered something under his breath, something I didn't quite catch, but it was enough. Enough to make me realize just how much he was shutting us out. Oliver, look at me, I said, my voice soft but firm. This isn't like you. This isn't what we've taught you. Oliver crossed his arms, a defiant stance I wasn't used to. You don't know anything, he spat, his eyes flashing with anger. You don't get it. I stood there, unsure of what to say. He was pulling away. I could feel it in every word he said, in every glance he threw our way. You don't get it either, he muttered, his voice low and filled with something that sounded like frustration, or maybe anger. Then, he turned and stomped up the stairs, leaving the tension thick in the air. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what had just happened. This was Oliver. My miracle. And yet, there was this growing distance between us, a chasm widening with every day, every action, every defiant word. Daniel exhaled sharply, turning to me. Evie, what are we missing here? I don't know, I whispered, my voice barely above a breath. I don't know anymore. The next few days were a blur. Oliver's behavior only seemed to escalate. He was sneaking out at night, returning at all hours with that same pungent smell of smoke clinging to his clothes. I'd asked him where he'd been, but he'd brushed me off with one-word answers, or no answers at all. And when I found a pack of cigarettes in his jacket pocket, well, that was the moment I realized I was no longer dealing with the sweet, thoughtful child I once knew. I was staring at someone I didn't recognize. His school suspensions came next. Another fight. This time, it was with a kid named Josh, who had supposedly made a snide comment about Oliver's clothes. The fight was violent, and when the school called me in, I could see the anger in his eyes that looked more like a stranger's than my own son's. And still, I defended him. It's just teenage rebellion, I repeated to Daniel, though the words didn't feel true anymore. I couldn't tell if I was trying to convince him or myself. One night, after I'd spent hours staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the rising tide of worry in my chest, Oliver came home later than usual. I was waiting in the living room, the lamp dim, the silence stretching between us. He came in through the front door, glancing quickly at me. "Where have you been?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. "Out," he replied shortly, his hand brushing past the doorknob. "No," I said, standing up, my heart hammering. "You're not going anywhere. Not until you answer me," he snapped, his face twisted in anger. "You don't get it," he screamed. "I'm not like you. I'm nothing like you." And with that, he ran up the stairs, his footsteps loud and final. Daniel and I stood in the quiet after. He reached for my hand, but the distance between us, between all of us, had never felt so vast. What had happened to my son? The boy who once begged me to read him one more story before bed. The child who had smiled so brightly when we picked him up from school that day, so full of joy. And now he didn't even look at us the same way. Was it just a phase? Or had I been wrong all along? The day everything changed didn't start with any warning. It wasn't like the other days where the cracks were small and fleeting, like whispers that could be ignored. No, this was loud and undeniable. This was the kind of day that would forever be etched into the fabric of my life. A day where every fear and doubt I'd ever buried deep inside suddenly rose to the surface. I remember it so clearly. Oliver was in PE, playing football as usual. He'd been doing well, according to his teacher. There had been no signs that anything was wrong. But when the phone rang at work, and I saw the caller ID flash up as the school, I felt the first hint of panic clutch at my throat. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I'd been here before. He'd had his fair share of falls, bruises, and small accidents. But something told me this time was different. "Mrs. Morris." The voice on the other end of the line was calm, but the words came too quickly. "We need you to come to the school right away. There's been an incident. Oliver's collapsed." I froze. Collapsed? Is he okay?" I managed to ask, my heart pounding in my chest. "We're not sure yet, but the paramedics are here." "Please come now." I didn't even think about the drive. I just got in the car. I could feel my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind racing through 1,000 scenarios. What did this mean? How serious was it? What if he was hurt? What if... I barely remember the drive. I just remember pulling into the school car park, the sound of my shoes slapping against the cold concrete as I rushed through the entrance. The hallways felt longer than usual, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And there they were. The paramedics. The stretcher. My heart sank to the pit of my stomach as I saw them lifting my son onto the stretcher, his face pale and still. My legs almost gave way beneath me. I wanted to run, to scream, to somehow turn back time, but I couldn't. I could only stand there, helpless, as the paramedics continued to work with practiced efficiency, ignoring my frantic calls to Oliver. "Oliver!" I shouted, trying to push through the crowd of onlookers. "Oliver! What's wrong with him?" One of the paramedics, a tall man with kind eyes, glanced at me for a moment, before placing a hand on my shoulder, gently steering me aside. "We're taking him to the hospital now, Mrs. Morris. It looks like he's severely anemic. We need to get him blood. It's serious." My breath caught. Anemia! My mind raced back to the last time I'd heard that word, something vague from a doctor's appointment I could barely recall. I needed to get to the hospital. I needed to be with my son. I didn't care about anything else, not the endless questions flooding my mind. Nothing else mattered except him. The hospital was a blur of white walls and sterile air. I barely registered the drive, or the nurses bustling about, or even Daniel, who arrived just moments after me. I saw his face, pale but still composed. He had a way of staying calm when everything else around him was falling apart. But even his calmness couldn't mask the tension in his eyes, the quiet panic I knew he was feeling, the same panic I was desperately trying to keep buried. They took Oliver into a room and hooked him up to an IV drip. His body seemed too still, too fragile for a boy his age. His color was off. His lips were too pale, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes that made my chest tighten with worry. A doctor, tall and brisk, entered the room. She was flipping through Oliver's chart, frowning as she read. I stood next to Daniel, my fingers clenched into fists at my sides. "We've done the initial tests," she said, not looking up from the chart. "Oliver is severely anemic. His blood count is dangerously low, and we need to administer blood right away. However," she paused for a moment, looking at us both, then back down at her clipboard. Her expression was calm but serious. "Mr. and Mrs. Morris, in situations like this, we typically find that one of the parents is a match for blood donation. Could we begin with you, Mr. Morris? We'll do a quick test to confirm compatibility." Daniel didn't hesitate. He stepped forward immediately, his face hardening with determination. "Test me first," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "Do whatever you need to do. I'll donate blood. Just make sure he's okay." The doctor nodded and instructed the nurse to take his blood for testing. I stood there beside Daniel, watching as they drew a sample from him. It felt like hours passed, but in reality it was just minutes. And then there was a shift in the air. I saw it first in the doctor's face. Her brow furrowed as she checked the test results, her eyes narrowing. She looked at her clipboard again, back at Daniel, then at me. "Mr. Morris, I'm afraid you're not a match," she said gently, but the words hit like a punch to the gut. "Not a match?" Daniel's voice was tight, like it was fighting to hold back something raw and jagged. "What do you mean, not a match? We're his parents. It's impossible." I felt my breath catch. What was she saying? I looked at Daniel, who was staring at the doctor with disbelief. The doctor cleared her throat, her voice growing softer. "Mr. Morris, I'm sorry, but your blood type and Oliver's are incompatible. We've also done further tests. His genotype does not match yours." My world tilted. I turned to Daniel, searching his face for some sign that this was a mistake, a misunderstanding. But all I saw was confusion, and then anger. Daniel's face twisted, and before I could even react, he exploded. 13 years, Evelyn? 13 bloody years of lies?" His voice echoed through the sterile room, bouncing off the walls, as though it were bouncing off the very core of our relationship. He was shaking now, his fists clenched at his sides, his face pale and contorted, with something close to fury. I froze. I couldn't breathe. My knees buckled slightly, and I grabbed the edge of the counter to steady myself. My mind raced. What was he saying? Lies? 13 years? The doctor stepped back, giving us space, but all I could hear was the deafening silence that followed Daniel's words. I need answers, Daniel snapped, his voice rising. Now! This doesn't make sense. He refused to look at me, his eyes locked onto the doctor's. This doesn't make sense. You're telling me I'm not his father? I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, to deny it, to make this all go away. But I couldn't. I'll arrange for a DNA test immediately, the doctor said, her voice calm but firm. But for now, we need to focus on Oliver's health. I heard Daniel's furious footsteps as he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The noise reverberated through my chest, leaving nothing but a hollow emptiness. I collapsed into a chair by the side of Oliver's bed, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I've never cheated on my husband, not even once. This must be wrong, I thought, over and over, my hands trembling in my lap. This can't be right. It has to be wrong. But somewhere deep down, in the hollow pit of my stomach, I knew this wasn't a mistake. I knew it was only the beginning. Before you continue listening, if you're enjoying the journey, don't forget to show me your support by subscribing. Your subscription means a lot. It helps keep these stories alive. And without you, there's no way I can continue sharing the twists, the turns, and the raw moments that speak to the heart. Please don't leave me hanging. Subscribe now. Thank you. The house felt emptier in the days that followed, despite the constant noise of life still buzzing around me. Still having to wash dishes, still making the bed, still folding clothes. I tried to push through the days like I had for the past 13 years, forcing myself to move, to breathe, to smile at Oliver as if everything were normal. But nothing felt normal. The weight of what had happened still sat heavy in the pit of my stomach, and no matter how much I tried to tell myself this was all a mistake, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I knew had shattered into pieces. Daniel moved out. He didn't say much, just grabbed a few things and left. The words were hanging between us, too dangerous to say out loud, too sharp to touch. He went to stay with his brother, Robert, in a small flat in town. I heard nothing from him for days, but the silence was worse than any argument we could have had. Our neighbors, once friendly faces, who'd waved at me from across the garden fence, started to avoid me. I could see the whispers behind cupped hands, the glances cast my way when I passed by, the awkward half-smiles that didn't reach their eyes. I wasn't blind to it. I had never been popular in the village. Daniel was always the better-liked of us. But now, it felt like they all knew. All of them. They knew the truth before I did. And the worst of it was the church. I had always been active there. Sunday mornings, I was on the committee, helping set up events, arranging flowers. But now, I felt the cold distance in their eyes, the way they sidestepped me, the way their words turned to murmurs when they thought I wasn't listening. They didn't know what had happened. They couldn't possibly understand. And yet, it felt as though they had already condemned me. Daniel's family made it clear they were angry. I was no longer invited to Sunday dinners. And his sister, Claire, sent me a message telling me to fix this for everyone's sake. The judgment was almost suffocating. Destroying everything, they said. A betrayal that could never be forgiven. But what could I say? I had never cheated on Daniel. I loved him. I would never have done anything to betray him. How could he not see that? How could he believe that I had lied to him for all these years? The days passed in a blur, each one indistinguishable from the last. I had tried to tell myself it was a mistake. The doctors had to be wrong. They had mixed up the results. They had to have. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became that this wasn't a mistake. I thought about Oliver's birth, the night that had been so full of chaos and fear. I had gone into labor late at night. It was long, agonizing, and by the time Oliver was born, I could barely remember the details. The emergency C-section, the flurry of doctors and nurses rushing in and out, the sense of panic in the air. The hospital was understaffed, the lights flickering overhead, the dull hum of the machines in the background. I remember one particular nurse, exhausted, her face pale as she handed me my baby, a rushed smile on her face. She told me how sorry she was for the complications, that everything would be all right. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, I wondered, had she made a mistake? Had they mixed up the babies? I clung to the memory. I had to. Because if that memory was wrong, if it wasn't mine, if Oliver wasn't mine, then where was my baby? I shuddered at the thought, but I had no choice but to face it. I had to get the answers. The lab results came back that morning. I sat in the quiet of the kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear as the doctor explained the findings. Oliver's blood type had come back as AS, but both Daniel's and my blood types were AA. I felt my chest tighten, the air in my lungs turning to ice. It wasn't just Daniel's blood that didn't match. Mine didn't either. We weren't his biological parents. The words felt like they didn't belong in my world, like I was hearing someone else's story, someone else's life, but they weren't someone else's. They were mine. "Are you sure?" I asked, barely able to get the words out. My voice was thin, fragile. "Are you absolutely sure?" The doctor was patient, his voice calm, but I could hear the pity beneath it. "Yes, Mrs. Morris. I'm afraid the results are clear. There's no mistake. Your blood types don't align with Oliver's. We've also checked against the records, and there's no indication of any genetic conditions that could cause this anomaly." There was a long silence. My hands trembled against the phone, my whole body stiff, as if I were waiting for something, anything, that would make this make sense. I had to see it for myself. I had to know. So I did what anyone in my position would do. I demanded another test. The next day, I went to the hospital to have my DNA tested. It was an impulsive decision, made in desperation and confusion. But I had to know. I had to be sure. I didn't know what was happening, but I refused to believe that I was not Oliver's mother. The nurse who took my blood was kind, though I could see the pity in her eyes, the sympathy that only made everything worse. I tried to smile at her, but it felt stiff, like a mask I couldn't remove. "You'll have the results in a few days," she told me, gently patting my hand. "We'll let you know as soon as we have them." I nodded, but in truth, I didn't want to wait. I needed answers. I needed them now. 2 days later, the phone rang again. I could hear the soft click of the receiver in my ear as I braced myself for whatever news was coming. "Mrs. Morris?" The doctor's voice was soft, almost apologetic. "The test results have come in." My stomach dropped. "And?" "I'm afraid the results are consistent with the earlier findings," he said. "You are not Oliver's biological mother." I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The words didn't make sense. How could this be? But I'm his mother," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm the one who gave birth to him. I've raised him." "I understand, Mrs. Morris. This is a difficult situation, but the evidence is clear. The tests don't lie." The world around me seemed to blur. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I didn't want to hear this. I didn't want to believe it. But deep down, I knew it was true. And that truth, that gut-wrenching, heart-shattering truth, was too much to bear. I don't remember walking to the bathroom. I don't remember locking the door. But I do remember sitting on the floor, my head between my knees, my hands shaking as I tried to hold myself together. Where was my baby? I whispered the question to the empty room. The words hung in the air, heavy and full of terror. If he wasn't mine, then where was my baby? I couldn't answer. I couldn't begin to imagine the answer. All I knew was that everything I thought I knew, everything I had built my life around, was a lie. A lie that I didn't choose. A lie that had been forced upon me without warning. The tears came then, silent and overwhelming. My body shook with them, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't make sense of it, and I didn't know how to move forward. I only knew one thing. My world had just shattered, and there was no turning back. I don't remember much about the drive to St. Alden's Hospital. Everything seemed foggy, like I was moving through a dream that I couldn't wake up from. The weight of everything, the questions that had no answers, and the sheer wrongness of it all. How could this be happening? By the time we arrived, I was exhausted, my eyes swollen from the nights spent crying and questioning everything I thought I knew about my life. Daniel was beside me, his face tight, but there was a hardness there now that hadn't been there before. He wasn't saying anything. He hadn't said much since the tests. The anger still burned in him, and I knew it wasn't just about Oliver. It was about me, too. I had failed him, and I didn't know how to make it right. We entered the hospital's administration wing, and I felt the familiar smell of disinfectant and bleach fill the air. It should have been comforting, familiar, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The walls, the sterile hallways, the faint hum of distant machines. It was all a blur. "I'm here to see the birth records from the night my son was born," I said, my voice steady, even though my hands were trembling. The receptionist looked at me over her glasses, eyebrows furrowed. "We don't keep birth records from that long ago, Mrs. Morris. You'll have to speak to the head nurse in the records department. It's a process." "Please, I don't have time for processes," I said, desperation creeping into my voice, despite my efforts to sound calm. "It's urgent. My son's life depends on it." She gave a tight-lipped smile, probably used to impatient parents, and pointed me down the hall. I didn't wait for Daniel. He followed me silently, the tension between us palpable, thick as the air in the room. The records room was small, cramped, with shelves stacked high with old files. Dust hung thick in the air like an unwanted presence. The place looked abandoned. The shelves creaked under the weight of years of forgotten paperwork. I walked up to the first shelf, running my fingers across the yellowed spines. I could feel my breath catching in my chest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Daniel sighed from the doorway, arms crossed over his chest. "We might be here all day, Evie, maybe longer. I don't know if this is going to help." I ignored him. I couldn't talk to him right now, not with the hurt I felt, not with the questions that were swirling inside my head. How did we get here? How did I not see this coming? I pulled out file after file, flipping through papers. Nothing. More nothing. My heart sank as the minutes passed, each one stretching out, each one weighing me down. But then, just as I was about to give up, I found it. A small file, tucked in the far corner behind several others, looked different from the others. Less worn, more recent. My fingers trembled as I slid it out. "Laura Whitmore," I read aloud to myself, the name echoing in the dusty room. I ran my finger down the page, my eyes scanning quickly. The birth date matched. The room number matched. My heart pounded in my chest as I skimmed the rest of the document. Laura Whitmore, a working-class woman from a nearby town. A name that meant nothing to me, yet suddenly, everything. I glanced back at Daniel, who had been watching me, silent, his face unreadable. "This is it," I said. "This is the proof. There's another child, a baby born the same night as Oliver." He looked at the document, then back at me. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, but something else too. A spark of hope? Or was it just more confusion? "We need to find her," I said. "We need to find Laura Whitmore." The drive to Laura Whitmore's house felt surreal, like I was entering someone else's life. I glanced at Daniel, who was driving, his jaw clenched. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight that his knuckles were white. I hadn't heard him speak in hours. The silence between us had grown unbearable. When we arrived at Laura's house, it was a small, modest home on the outskirts of town. Nothing extravagant, just a typical working-class neighborhood. I knocked on the door, my heart in my throat. It took a moment, But the door swung open, revealing a woman in her 40s, with tired eyes but a soft, kind face. She looked at us for a moment, confusion flickering across her face, before she said, "Can I help you?" "I'm Evelyn Morris," I said, trying to steady my voice. "I'm here because I think you may have something of mine. A child." Laura's eyes flickered to the side, then back to me. She stepped aside without a word, gesturing for us to come inside. Inside, the house was warm, neat, though it was clear she hadn't been expecting guests. There was a quiet, tense atmosphere, and I could feel it. The same feeling I had the moment I'd seen Oliver's blood results. Something is wrong. Something has been wrong from the start. The living room was small, cozy, but I couldn't focus on the furniture. I couldn't focus on anything except the boy who was standing quietly by the door, staring at us. He looked so familiar. Too familiar. "Ethan, sweetheart, come here," Laura said, her voice trembling slightly. The boy walked forward, his movements slow and measured. He had soft brown hair, kind eyes, and a quiet presence that made my heart skip a beat. And then it hit me. His eyes. The shape of his jaw. His nose. He looked exactly like Daniel. My throat tightened. I had to blink several times to keep my tears from spilling. "Ethan, this is Mrs. Morris," Laura said, her voice soft. "She's come to—" "I think I know why she's here," Ethan said quietly, his voice almost too calm for the weight of the situation. He turned to me, his eyes searching my face. "You're looking for your son, aren't you?" I could feel my breath hitch in my throat. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I had the strength to speak. Laura broke down then, her face crumpling with the force of her sobs. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she said between gasps for air. "I never wanted this. I thought my son was mine." Michael, her husband, had been standing in the corner, silent, his face pale. But now he stepped forward, placing a hand on Laura's shoulder. He didn't speak, but the shock in his eyes said everything. Both families, I realized, were in the same position. Both of us had raised the wrong children. I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me, a sickening, dizzying feeling. The shock of it all was too much to bear. I had raised someone else's son. And now this boy, this Ethan, was standing in front of me, someone I had never known, but who was so much like Daniel that it was as if he had stepped out of our family's past. Ethan didn't say anything else. He just looked at me, his gaze heavy, as if waiting for me to speak, to make sense of it all. I felt the weight of Oliver's absence, the overwhelming love I still felt for him, tug at my heart. We sat in silence for a moment, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Finally, it was Daniel who spoke. "We need to figure this out," he said, his voice rough. "For the boys." I looked at him, my heart aching. For the boys. And I knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same again. Later that evening, after long, quiet discussions, both families agreed. It would take time, but we would begin the slow, painful process of transitioning the boys. Ethan would come to live with us, and Oliver, well, Oliver would stay in the hospital, continuing his treatment. The thought of letting him go, even for a little while, filled me with dread. But I couldn't stop loving him. How could I? He had grown inside my heart, even if not my body. I stayed by Oliver's side that night, my hand resting on his bed, watching him sleep. How do I stop loving a child who grew inside my heart, even if not my body? The answer, I realized, was that I never could. And so, we agreed to begin the painful transition. Slowly, cautiously, we would all have to adjust. The first time Ethan stepped into our home, I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. He was quiet, like always, his eyes observing everything with that careful, thoughtful manner he had. His brown hair was neatly combed, and he wore a soft sweater, faded blue jeans. There was a stillness to him, an almost too mature quality for his age, like he was carrying something heavy inside that he wasn't ready to share. "Hi, Mrs. Morris," he said when I opened the door, his voice soft, a little uncertain. I smiled, though it didn't reach my eyes. "Please call me Evelyn. Come in, Ethan." He stepped inside, glancing around, taking in our home with a quiet curiosity. I could feel my heart racing as I closed the door behind him. He looks so much like Daniel. He has his eyes, the shape of his jaw, even the way he carries himself. And yet, there was a distance in him, an unfamiliarity that made everything feel out of place. How do you bond with a boy you've never known, but who's somehow always been a part of your family? I didn't know, but the longer Ethan was there, the more I realized that I couldn't ignore the strange, almost magnetic pull I felt toward him. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't just because of his resemblance to Daniel. It was something deeper, a quiet recognition, like I was seeing a version of what could have been, or perhaps a version of what should have been. Ethan was different from Oliver in almost every way. Where Oliver was loud and brash, Ethan was quiet, thoughtful. He seemed to absorb everything around him without speaking much. He had this way of sitting back and watching, as though he was constantly processing the world in his own way. He was gentle, though, in a way that made my heart ache. When I offered him something to drink, he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Morris," his voice a bit shy. I could tell he wasn't used to being asked about his preferences. As I made him a cup of tea, my mind was in a haze. How could I explain this to him? How could I explain this to anyone? At the same time, Oliver was learning the truth about everything. His counselor had called us in, both Daniel and me, and told us that the time had come to tell him. He was old enough now to understand, to process the reality of what had happened. The truth. It wasn't just a matter of biological connections. It was a matter of life and family, of everything he had known being turned upside down. I didn't know how to prepare myself for his reaction. I didn't know how to prepare for anything anymore. The moment we told him, his face twisted in confusion, then fury. He looked at me like I was a stranger. "You mean I'm not even your son?" He spat, his voice full of rage. "So I'm just some mistake you took home?" I tried to speak, tried to explain the complexities of it all, but he wouldn't listen. His anger was like a storm, violent and uncontrollable. With a cry of frustration, he swept his arm across the table, sending a glass crashing to the floor, shards scattering everywhere. "I hate you!" he screamed, his voice raw with pain. "I hate you! I hate all of this!" And then he stormed out. I could feel my heart break as he disappeared out the door. But even more than the pain, I felt fear. Fear that I was losing him, losing the child I had loved, raised, nurtured. The child who had once been my everything. It wasn't long before the phone call came. The police had found Oliver, caught stealing from a shop in the high street. He had been in trouble before, of course. Small misdemeanors, petty things. But this felt different. This felt like a crack, a fracture in something that could never be repaired. "Evie," Daniel said later that night as we sat in our living room, "what are we supposed to do? This isn't him. This isn't the boy we raised." I wanted to argue with him, to tell him that this wasn't just about Oliver's behavior. It wasn't just about the thefts or the fights. It was about everything that had been taken from us, everything that had been stolen. But I couldn't find the words. "I don't know what to do," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't know how to fix this." Daniel sat there, his face pale, his shoulders slumped. He didn't speak for a long time. I could hear the tension in the room, the weight of all our unspoken fears. After a long silence, he stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. This can't go on like this, Evie. We need help. The counselors, the legal people, they're all involved now. There's no going back." I nodded, though my heart felt heavy with the decision we both knew had to come. It wasn't just about Oliver anymore. It was about doing what was right, even if it meant tearing apart everything we had built. The legal processes started soon after. Lawyers, meetings, paperwork, and endless conversations. I hated it. I hated every minute of it. But it was the only way forward, it seemed. Oliver completed his treatment in the hospital. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the day finally arrived. It was raining when we made the exchange. I stood there, drenched from the downpour, waiting for Ethan to arrive. I hadn't seen Oliver for days, and the pit in my stomach was unbearable. When the car pulled up, I saw him immediately, his messy hair, his tired eyes. He looked so different now, older, broken in a way that I couldn't fix. But he was still my son, still the boy who had once been my entire world. I rushed to him, pulling him into my arms, holding him tightly, not caring that my clothes were getting soaked. He cried against my shoulder, his sobs racking his body. "You'll always be my first heartbeat," I whispered into his hair. "Always." He didn't answer, but I could feel the weight of the words between us. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I would never stop loving him. Later that day, after the exchange, Ethan moved in with us. The house felt different with him there. Everything was quieter, slower. I didn't know how to interact with him. He was still a stranger to me, and I was still a stranger to him. He called me Mrs. Morris at first, the words coming out awkwardly. But after a few days, it started to feel less strange. We began to cook together, share small moments, talking at night, making jokes about Daniel's terrible cooking, listening to music. One night, Ethan sat quietly at the dining table, his pencil moving swiftly across a sketch pad. I watched him for a moment, not saying anything, just letting him work. He always seemed so absorbed in his art, and I found myself fascinated by it. After a while, he turned the page and pushed it across the table toward me. It was a portrait of Daniel and me. At first, I didn't understand. My heart squeezed painfully as I looked at the drawing. Ethan had captured something that felt like home. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And I knew, in that moment, that he was beginning to see us, not just as his new family, but as people who were trying to understand him, to bring him into our fold. This was a small step, I realized. A small, quiet step in what was going to be a long journey. But it was a start. And for now, that was enough. I smiled, my voice thick with emotion. "It's beautiful, Ethan." "Thank you." He looked at me, his expression softening, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Maybe a little hope, maybe a little peace. And then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's you. All of you." It was a gesture of belonging. And for the first time since all of this started, I felt a glimmer of something that felt like home. But as I sat there, gazing at the portrait, I couldn't shake the question that lingered in the back of my mind. How do you move forward when your family is not the one you thought it was? It had been months since Ethan moved in with us, but the house still felt different. Not bad, just different. It was a quiet shift, a subtle change in the air, like we were all learning how to breathe in new spaces, in new roles. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, the house too still, too silent, and wonder if it had all been a dream. But then I'd hear the soft sounds of Ethan's footsteps, the hum of the kettle, the way he sat by the window in the mornings, drawing in the notebook he carried everywhere. It wasn't a dream, it was our new reality. Daniel and I had our share of struggles, of course. Things were far from perfect. There were nights we barely spoke, staring out of our windows as if our lives were separate, though we were still sitting side by side. But we tried. We tried to repair, to piece things together, one moment at a time. The hardest part wasn't just that Ethan was living with us now. It was the absence of Oliver. The house felt too empty without him. His laughter was gone, replaced by a quiet, awkward silence that lingered in his absence. I couldn't help but wonder, what is he doing? What is he feeling? He was still my son, still in my heart, even if we were worlds apart. It was Daniel who finally pushed us to reach out, to make contact. It was his idea, even if I was terrified to take the first step. He was the one who called the Whitemoors, and he was the one who suggested we visit them. Slowly, surely, we began to rebuild some bridge, though I feared it would never be the same. How could it be? The day Oliver finally came to visit us was a strange one. It was a Thursday early evening when the doorbell rang. I'd been standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, and I felt my pulse quicken at the sound. Daniel wasn't home yet, and for a second, I thought I might imagine it. But then I heard a knock at the door. I opened it. There he was. My son. His hair was longer, untamed, and his eyes. God, those eyes. He looked so much older than the last time I saw him, as though he'd grown up in the short months he'd been with the Whitemoors. His hands were shoved in his pockets, and his expression was guarded, like he didn't know what to say, didn't know if it was okay to even be here. The look on his face told me everything. He was lost, unsure, but he was here. He came. I swallowed, my throat tight. Oliver, I whispered, stepping forward, my heart a tangled mess of longing, regret, and hope. He nodded, a small, almost reluctant movement. Hi, Mum. The word Mum cut through me like a blade. It felt like he was finally coming back, like he was still mine, even after everything. But there was so much distance in his eyes, so much that I could barely reach him. Come in, darling, I said, stepping aside to let him through. I didn't know if I should hug him or just stand there. I had so much I wanted to say. I wanted to say I was sorry. I wanted to say I loved him. But the words stuck in my throat. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, I felt a familiar weight lift off my shoulders. It was him. It was my son. The silence between us was heavy, thick with everything that had happened, the anger, the heartbreak, the betrayal, and the love that still managed to survive it all. We sat down at the kitchen table, and I poured him a cup of tea. The steam curled up from the mug, the comforting scent of chamomile filling the room. But the silence hung over us like a thick fog, each of us waiting for the other to speak. Finally, he broke it. I'm sorry, Oliver said, his voice barely audible, his eyes trained on the mug in his hands. I didn't know where I fit anymore. Everything felt like it was falling apart, and I didn't know what to do. I felt a lump in my throat. He sounded so small, so vulnerable, even though he was a teenager now. I wanted to reach out, to pull him close, but I didn't. I didn't know if it was too soon. You were never misplaced in love, Oliver, I said, my voice thick with emotion. You were only misplaced in paperwork, but in my heart. You always belonged. You always will. Tears welled up in his eyes, and for the first time in so long, I saw the boy I raised, the boy who had once been my world. I'm sorry, he whispered again, and this time I couldn't hold back. I reached for him, pulling him into my arms, holding him like I had when he was a child, small enough to fit perfectly in my lap. He buried his face in my shoulder, his shoulders shaking with the weight of everything he had carried for so long. Daniel arrived home soon after, and it was a quiet reunion. He wasn't sure what to say either, but when Oliver turned to him, eyes red and face full of guilt, Daniel took a deep breath, stepped forward, and hugged him. I should have believed you, Evie, Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. I should have known you, your heart better. I'm sorry I doubted you. The next months were a blur of counseling sessions, awkward moments, and healing in fits and starts. We had to rebuild everything, piece by fragile piece. But we did it together. Slowly, but surely, we rebuilt. The damage had been done, But it wasn't irreparable, and in time, we learned to trust again. But the real reckoning came when we finally confronted St. Alden's Hospital. The legal process had taken longer than I had anticipated, dragging us through the courts, through endless discussions with lawyers and legal teams. I was exhausted by it all, but I knew we had to do it. We had to confront the hospital, to find the answers, even if those answers couldn't fix anything. The day of the courtroom hearing was tense. The room was filled with lawyers, with families, and with questions. When the negligent nurse finally took the stand, I felt my stomach twist. She looked older now, her face tired and worn. When she admitted her mistake, how she had swapped the name tags on the incubators in the chaos of that understaffed night, it was like the breath left my body. All those years of wondering, all the nights of silence and heartbreak, finally found their explanation. "We're sorry," she said, almost quietly. "It was an error. We didn't realize what had happened until it was too late." The judge nodded and awarded us compensation. But none of it mattered. Not really. What could money fix? What could compensation heal? In the end, it was only the truth that could set us free. 1 year later, Ethan stood in the living room, looking at me with a small, shy smile. "Mom!" he said. I froze, my heart skipping. I couldn't help it. He was still getting used to the word, but hearing it, "Mom," made everything feel like it was falling into place. Slowly, piece by piece, our family was whole again. Oliver, too, visited often. The awkwardness between the two boys was gone now. They had started to bond in their own way, building something new, brotherhood, in a way that felt both strange and wonderful. As I watched them, I thought of the journey we had all been on, all the mistakes, all the heartache, all the time lost. But I also thought of the love we'd fought for, the love we'd chosen again and again. And so, as the days went on, as the seasons changed, I found myself finally at peace. "Blood may speak, yes," I whispered softly, my voice reflective. "But love, the love we choose again and again, writes the story that remains." And that was all that mattered now. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss out on the next story. Please subscribe now to keep following more stories, and turn on the notification bell to get exclusive updates straight to your inbox. Your support helps me keep creating these stories that speak to the heart